understand it, it would come through on an email, like a WAV file.
Like we
so
do.
you could listen to it. I think it, yes. So you will.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our virtual roundtable on communicating about history. My name is Eileen Corcoran, and I'm the Director of Service and Outreach at the Vermont Historical Society. We're excited to have everyone here today. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tori Hart, who is the Director of Stewardship and Public Relations at VHS, who's going to kick us off with a little bit of presentation about the topic, and then we'll have a wonderful chance to think about and discuss what she's put forward to us and go from there. So Tori, I turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I've got a few visuals just to have something to look at while we're going through my presentation. And then, like Eileen said, I'll bring us all back together so we can have some discussions. Like Eileen said, certainly feel free to ask questions during the presentation. I really don't want it to take long, as this is a roundtable. I really want to make sure that we're spending more time on the discussion piece of everything. So I'm going to share my screen, and so you guys all kind of be on the sidebar, and Eileen's going to keep me on task. All right, is that visible for everybody? Great. All right, so just a quick little bit about me. So as Eileen said, I'm the Director of Stewardship and Public Relations at the Vermont Historical Society. I've got an MA degree in History Museum Studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program. I've been in the nonprofit world for about 12 years now, 7 of which have been at VHS. So just to give you a little background, Communicating About History is a report that came out of a partnership between the American Association for State and Local History, the Frameworks Institute, which is basically a polling survey company that they brought in, the National Council on Public History, and the Organization of American Historians. And what they were basically doing was they started to ask, with everything that's been going on in the world and in the field over the last few years, how does the public think about history? And how can we use that knowledge to more effectively communicate about the work that we do and the value that we have to society? I've got some links that I can share afterwards so you guys can see some of the actual reports that came out of this survey that they did. But right now we'll just kind of share more of the results side of that for now. So basically they were asking, what is it that we as historians are trying to communicate to the public? We're trying to communicate things like, what is history? Why is history important to society? Where do people go to learn about the past? What are the challenges to our society when we engage with the past? And what can we do to support how our society engages with the past? So what they found so there was kind of a two-part report that happened. One came out right as the pandemic hit in 2020, and then they did some more reporting that came out in 2021. So in the initial report, they were mostly focused on some challenges for us with some opportunities. So some of the challenges that they found throughout this survey was that the public thinks of history as a series of chronological events that are just driven by the actions of key individuals. Basically, the public believes that history is just about recording and documenting just the facts, and that people really can't tell the difference between analysis and personal opinion. So they think when we're stating something after comparing multiple sources, that we are making a personal opinion on it rather than an informed analysis or interpretation. People also think that learning about the past just means absorbing facts and figures. And it was interesting because we were chatting with somebody yesterday who was not from the history field. And her first comment was, you know, I'm really kind of traumatized by history from my high school days, because it was just, I didn't know how to memorize these dates and times. So this is very actively a public perception that is still out there and exists, that, you know, history is just, you know, the Revolutionary War started on this date. And obviously we know that we're doing so much more than that. So how do we tell the public that? Some other challenges that they found is that there is a belief that there's basically these mainstream narratives that the public is required to learn, and that narratives of marginalized communities are extras. So those are only relevant to the people who are impacted by it. They believe we should just learn that, you know, George Washington is the only person that matters in the American Revolution, and that anybody else who, you know, that's just added extras that aren't needed. Many members of the public are very reluctant to talk about painful or troubling things that happened in the past, especially when it comes to recognizing harm that's been done to historically oppressed groups. Public sees history as a non-essential hobby, and that people are pretty much fatalistic about the possibility of how history is taught in the schools. We're seeing a lot of that obviously right now, that basically we're not teaching history in the schools, or we're not teaching the right history in the schools, and that everybody has an opinion on how history is being taught, and that we're not doing it the right way. So those were some of the things that they came out of the survey from the public. They were directly interacting with people, and these are kind of the trends that emerged. So one of the things that happened in the initial report is that there was some opportunities. You know, what do we do with this? Okay, we know these are the challenges. So how do we combat those? What can we do? And so luckily, there's still a lot of opportunity out there for us to kind of to change and challenge some of these opinions. There is some understanding among the public that knowing history helps society, that knowing history does help society learn from our past mistakes. Obviously, we saw not so much mistakes, but, you know, that learning from the past is just helpful. Obviously, during the, you know, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've all been looking back at the 1918 influenza pandemic to try to see what worked, what didn't, what public messages were they putting out there, what types of medical advice was being given at the time. So there is some understanding, especially recently, that, you know, there are things that we can learn from our history that can help us today. The public does see how a shared understanding of the past creates a sense of belonging in our communities. And that people recognize that the more perspectives you have of the past, the better it's able to be understood. So reiterating a lot of times that, you know, we're not changing history, we're not deleting history, but that we're constantly adding to history and our understanding of it for a better perspective. The public has some understanding of the power dynamics that are involved in discourses about the past. You know, so there's always that kind of winner-victim narrative, winner-loser kind of narrative, and that there's power dynamics on who gets to tell the story. And that the public does have a surface level understanding of the importance of museums in learning about our past. So with these opportunities, AASLH spent another year to basically come up with some recommendations that they have for us. You know, these are the opportunities. What can we do with them? What are they recommending for us as history organizations to kind of continue to talk about the importance of the work that we do? So one of the things that they're recommending is that we talk about critical thinking to shift perceptions about what history work involves. So, you know, that we are comparing multiple sources, that we are making an informed analysis of the past, comparing historical interpretation to detective work. There's always been this idea of kind of comparing history work to journalism, but then you kind of get into that kind of area where people then think that there's this one idea of truth when it comes to history, which can be problematic. So they're actually recommending that we talk about our work as detectives instead, that we're constantly learning as we find new data, that we're changing our opinions, that we're adding to our opinions. And so really, not that we are detectives, but that history work is like detective work. Emphasizing how history helps us make progress towards a just world, and how that is important to increasing the history's importance. And using, this is where you guys especially come in, using those really location, place-based specific solutions, focused examples to build support for inclusive history. So, you know, how do you take a large national event and really make it relevant to how it's impacted your town, really gets people to relate better to it. And once they can relate to it, there's a better chance at them understanding it. So why are we doing any of this? So basically talking, you know, what are the benefits to you in your organization? Why do you want to be thinking about these things? Talking about critical thinking helps people to better understand what historical interpretation means. It builds its appreciation and support, which means then that people are more likely to devote greater resources to the work that you're doing. Obviously, financial resources, making sure that they're making, if you're supported by your town budget, that they're making room for you guys. They want to make sure that this is a priority. The detective metaphor is highly effective in building a more accurate understanding of the process that we use when we're doing history work. So looking at multiple sources, looking at conflicting accounts, updating our views, and making comparisons so we have a better understanding of the fuller picture of a story. The value of progress confirms that we must learn from the past in order to move forward from the future, both from what we did right, but also what we did wrong. Connecting progress and justice helps orient the public towards a more inclusive version of history, which leads to a better understanding that history is important to everyone, not just people who are interested in a certain area. And then using specific local place-based examples helps people directly connect those events to themselves, makes them very personal to them. And obviously, as we continue to diversify and incorporate, we need to incorporate more people and stories into the stories that we're telling on a local and a statewide level as well, so that more people can see and place themselves into that narrative and make it relevant and engaging for themselves. I'm going to drop these in the chat after too, so you guys can actually click on them. These are some of the resources that are out there about this topic from ASLH. So I'll copy and paste those in shortly, but I'm going to bring us back together. I've got some discussion questions we can go through, or obviously I want you guys to ask questions as well. And Eileen's going to help moderate all of that.
Great, thank you, Tori. So yeah, I would say, if anybody has any sort of questions or thoughts to start us off based on what Tori was talking about, again, feel free to unmute yourself, put it in the chat, raise your hand, and we'll get to you. All right, doesn't look like my questions and hopefully get the ball rolling with you guys. Let's see if I can I've got them up, Tori, or did you have a question you wanted to sort of ask?
I mean, I think we can just start because I think I built them so that they kind of went through from the beginning. So I think just generally speaking, what's a common misconception about the work that you guys are doing that you wish you could challenge?
I guess one thing I might say is that the difference between olden times and current times is that people in the past didn't know as much, or that the things they knew about weren't as important, or weren't as are in no way relevant to what we need to know now. I guess that's sort of the bias that people seem to approach a lot of historical research with. Like, it's interesting, but it's not really useful.
Any other thoughts that anybody wants to add on that one? Yeah, Lauren. Nope, I think you're muted still.
There we go. Sorry, this is a brand new computer. I wasn't at all sure I even had this downloaded, so yay. I'm with the Moncton Historical Society. We're optimistically called the Moncton Museum and Historical Society, but we don't quite have a museum just yet, but we're hoping to. We're working on another history tour of our town. We started with a walking tour, and now we're doing a driving tour of one of the boroughs of town. And I think our biggest struggle, which is this conversation I think is somewhat about, is how do we go from our interest in diving deep into the details of history? We're spending forever going through all of the old newspapers and town reports, and make that an interesting story for the general public, for people even as young as fourth graders. So where do we find the fun in some of the details that we are fascinated by? You know, we three who are doing this deep research think it's fascinating, but we need to sort of figure out what are messages that the community wants to hear and appreciate.
Yeah, I think that is a fantastic aspect of again the work of making history accessible in a lot of ways, and finding what are the stories or the bits and parts that resonate with the most people, or the people or the audience that you're trying to reach. Anybody have any sort of thoughts or ideas about how they've maybe taken a complex topic or project and built something out of it for sort of a specific audience?
I don't have a suggestion. I have a similar problem, though. I'm at the Bennington Museum. I'm currently putting together an exhibit called A History of Bennington, which is looking at the history of Bennington from a variety of very different and unexpected perspectives. And I've been doing some experimentation with our Facebook page and putting out things that are going to be in this exhibit with little blurbs about them. So we're talking about the Battle of Bennington, but I'm not talking about the Green Mountain Boys. I'm going to be talking about this bread bowl that was used by a local woman. She supposedly baked 80 loaves of bread before the Battle of Bennington. And there are all these other fun stories about her. And so I post something like that to our Facebook page, and it gets a few dozen likes and maybe one comment that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about with women's history. I post a picture of downtown Bennington in 1890, and people are all over that. Like, it is just the greatest thing ever. And it's not, I don't even give any information with it. It's just, a picture of downtown Bennington and whatever. And I can add some information to it, but it's never what I think is interesting that people are actually connecting with. So, and like I said, this is not a suggestion at all, because I struggle with this, like how to make the actual deep issues matter to people, and to have them actually understand that there is there is relevant stuff here. Like, if we're talking about women's rights, this is something we're still talking about today. And if I'm talking about women's rights in 1777, when Mary Dewey was stuck up all night baking loaves of bread and watching her husband go off to war and had very little say in matters what was going on, that is very relevant. That is how we got where we are today. And trying to make that connection and trying to get people to appreciate that connection without whacking them literally over the head with a 2x4 that says women's rights. I don't know. But they love pictures of your town from 100 and 200 years ago. That's a big hit.
We definitely see the same thing on our social media pages, if it makes you feel better.
It's a common thing, I'm sure.
I really think this is where, and this is what's hard, because how can you decide what's really going to be personal to every person that we're trying to reach out and engage to, whether that is a fourth grade student or somebody who's at the end of their life. But that's the thing that I think that we're trying to unlock, right? Is how do we make these things really personal to people? Because what people want is something that's relevant to them, whether that's this cool old photo of the town that they live in. So there's that, that's the piece that they're seeing is oh, cool, this is the place that I live, and this is what it looked like once upon a time. And I love that. And it really doesn't go deeper than that, to something that's relevant today. So like, you know, talking about, you know, things that we're interested in, you know, how do we make those engaging to students, or, you know, how do we make it that they care about, like, that we have more rights, or women have more rights, hopefully, you know, still going in that direction today than they did back then. And it's almost like you have to drill down to, you know, what was it like for her to make this 80 loaves of bread? You know, what do we bake? How long does it take you to make something, you know, whether that's a kid? I don't know. I mean, obviously I don't have the answers to that. We're still struggling with that same piece. But especially with the 4th grade students, I mean, anything that they can is something that they see at their home, or that they touch upon, or if it's the street that they walk down every day to school, and you show them a picture and it's like, this is what it looked like for the people 50 years ago or 100 years ago walking down the street that you're passing. Those are the things that make them stop and say, wow, or just grab their attention for a second, if nothing else. I don't know, does anybody else have any either similar experiences, or they found something that worked with engaging in a way that you maybe hadn't seen before?
Tori, it's Peter. My observation of the thread that you introduced that already was talked about is oftentimes if you have an artifact, whether it's a picture, a piece of everyday life, a bread pan from 1928, and then you can tell a story around that artifact that breathes some life and relevance into it. That's a grabber from my point of view. That draws somebody in.
Yeah, Lauren. Muted again.
There we go. Sorry, I will get used to this. I do think that that point is an excellent one, that some artifact, something that they can see and hold, definitely engages people. As a former teacher, I know that it's the stories about people that really do hook people. So I think if you can find a combination of the thing and the people, it's great. In the current work we're doing, part of our, I think the easy story is that the elementary school closed, all of the elementary schools in town closed in 1960, and a new one pulled everybody together. But we're now interviewing people who went to school in those places where there's no longer a building standing, you know. So you ask the kids to look at this field and imagine that being a school. And, you know, here's the story from Mrs. So-and-so down the street. I think that really can pull them in. How I get them interested past that, you know, we'll see. But I do think it's a combination, Peter, you're right, of both a thing that they can see, feel, touch, and then the personal stories. And then you somehow drag out those personal stories into the deeper questions that you were asking to bring together that sense of belonging that you mentioned. I think that might be our hook for the work we're trying to do.
Yeah, so question in the chat from Ethan Allen. I don't know if this is Angie or somebody else, but sort of writing about, again, hearing a lot about what's happening in Florida, especially regarding special interest groups demanding curriculum changes. Are there any such initiatives in Vermont? And has anyone experienced public dissatisfaction with what you're doing at that location? So yeah, from the standpoint of the state, I will say the state is actually working on adopting new standards related to diversity and ethnic studies. So kind of maybe going in a hopeful different direction than Florida, but anybody have sort of some of those experiences with some of what Tori was talking about in those challenges as to people, you know, sort of either not wanting to talk about troubling history or wanting to sort of think there's only one interpretation that we should all be talking about and not talking about sort of different narratives.
I have a story that's sort of relevant to this. So I don't know if you've ever been to the Bennington Museum and seen the sculpture of Lincoln that we have right outside our front door. It's Lincoln with a naked lady and a naked boy, both subjugated before him. And it was vandalized earlier, well, last year now. And that was taken care of. And our director at the time decided that our current director actually, yes, this was still the current director. So he decided that we were going to take advantage of this. We were going to do a program around it and start this whole lecture series. And so our programs manager came up with something, got a bunch of people coming in, and we started promoting this thing on Facebook. And I wasn't surprised by the amount of backlash, but there was a significant amount of backlash of people who did not want to talk about this, but who kept telling me that we should keep it in the collection and use it as a teaching tool, but clearly were not at all interested in it being used as a teaching tool. There were maybe 24 people came to the program, and there were 2 that I didn't recognize who don't come to all of our programs. It was mostly our usual suspect. And it was a good thing. I'm so glad that we did it, but there's definitely a large segment of our population that is not terribly interested in hearing any narrative other than what they're used to, or what they think they should be used to, at least. And they are very threatened when you start attacking a character like Abraham Lincoln. The sculpture is still there. We haven't done away with it, despite my personal opinion. I'm not a fan. But even when I like mention something like the fact that like this is a paternalistic depiction of Lincoln, like even that gets backlash, like blatantly obvious, like this is clearly a paternalistic, this is reflective of the paternalistic attitudes of the day when this thing was created. And even that people got upset about.
I have a question, actually, I'm at the Mountaintop Historical Society in the Catskills in New York. And I have received some letters from the same person, and I'm sure that it's a small community, so I'm sure there's at least a few other people who feel the same way. A lot of our programming does reflect every month is celebrated. For instance, February, Black History Month, March is Women's Heritage Month, and so on and so forth. And I do get people who think that we are being divisive by choosing these subjects. And obviously, I think it's obvious that it's coming from a narrow-minded, bigoted place, especially when they're so angry about it. But rather, and at the Historical Society, we have chosen to just continue on with our programming as if this backlash isn't coming in. But I wonder if that is necessarily the right way to proceed. Do you address the backlash, or do you just continue on as if it's not happening and it's all behind the scenes?
That's a great question. Does anybody have any thoughts on that, or things that they've done with similar situations?
This is John at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. I'll just chime in. I'm not sure if I got the whole thread of that, of what was said there, but in terms of a backlash, I don't think we have to be concerned with that, because when we do our tours, most of the people we come, as you know, are 95% of them are out-of-staters. The name Ethan Allen has captured their imagination from someplace, not necessarily the furniture company anymore, but they know that Ethan Allen was a controversial figure. And I think we say that right up front, that there are many interpretations of Ethan, and it's up to them to draw their own conclusions about what they think about him. What I have found to be most effective when I do tours, we only have them for about an hour and a half, and it includes a 15-minute introductory video. But when I take them up to the house, we show them the writings of Ethan. And we'll take, for example, I like to take the narrative that he wrote about his captivity, which some people feel is more of a novel than a journal. But I'll ask one of the visitors to just open it up at a random page, and we'll read a few sentences from that. And then I will try to interpret put it in the context of Ethan's experience. And when they leave, we hope that they'll be at least interested enough to look into maybe Ethan or early Vermont or early American history as a result of their visit with us.
Yeah, I think that's some of the important things that, that ASLH is recommending based on the study that they've done nationally, is that, the more that we can encourage people to think for themselves, to show them that these are primary sources. So, right. So, I mean, there's no arguments. Going back to the curriculum question too, the loophole is always primary sources. As long as you have something that you're going back to, that's written, it's from a time, it just is, and it's up to them and us too to say, the more sources that you can look at, the more analysis that you can do, you can come to all these different opinions, and sometimes that there is no right or wrong answer to those stories either, that we are just presenting them with the not facts, but we're presenting them with the sources, we're presenting them with the stories, and that really, these are conclusions that we're making that are informed based on these sources that we have. But also too, I might be losing my train of thought on this one, but that, that we are, I think the biggest thing that I've learned from just, kind of reading some of these reports is the biggest thing that we're trying to say was we're trying to tell stories, is one that we feel it is our responsibility at the Vermont Historical Society to tell the stories of all Vermonters and people who are connected with that past. So, everyone. So, we're just trying to figure out, how do we do that? How do we tell all the stories, and how do we make sure that everybody feels like they are a part of that story? But also too, that we are not taking away from history by making these analyses, that, history is very additive. And I think the more that we can talk about that additive perspective of history, that we're constantly learning, that constantly there's new sources, there's new facts for us to unearth, that it doesn't just come to an end and stop. We are always learning more about our history and about ourselves. And I think the more that you can present that, you can't really argue with that, right? We are just constantly learning more about ourselves, who we are as a people, whose stories impact that larger narrative that we all play into. We can kind of change threads a little bit. One of the things I think that goes along with this is, are there any other, I think we talked about it a little bit, but have there been some new sources that you all have worked with lately, or any new historical understandings about your own town that you changed the ways in which you're talking about the stories from your town?
We have a really exciting one. So we recently worked with the Stopping Stones program, which commemorates the site where Black people were enslaved. And we discovered a woman whose name was Margaret Bowen. She was normally called Peg, who was enslaved at the famous Catamount Tavern in Bennington, where the Green Mountain Boys met, and was enslaved by Stephen Fay, one of our great founding fathers here in Bennington. And we worked with the Porter Phelps mansion down in Massachusetts, which has the papers of her enslavers, including a diary kept by a woman there the woman of the household who enslaved Peg. And she writes about her. And they also have a receipt signed by Stephen Fay selling this woman back to Hadley, Massachusetts, a year after the Vermont Constitution supposedly outlawed slavery. Really, 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 really interesting. So that's a story that we're going to be working into the exhibit that's opening later this year. And it's also, as we don't talk a lot about Black people here in Bennington, we don't talk a lot about Black people in Vermont in general, certainly not here at the museum. So this is a really, it's a really important step for us. And having so much information about this particular woman and this story is, it's been a really great experience and something that I'm really excited that we're actually doing now. And I haven't had any trouble with it. Like, no one's complained that we've added this story, but I'm not taking down Lincoln to, you know, put her up. So I guess that's probably why.
Callie, would you be willing to drop a link into the chat about how you contacted those folks?
Sure.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have a story like that that they want to share?
So I think I'm going to jump in and put one of my plugs in here, you know, again, thinking about sort of how we create inclusive history and sort of some of the difficulties in, I guess, sort of finding these stories in the past because we didn't sort of write them down or we didn't value them, is that we are now 20 plus years into a new century. And, you know, I think as Lauren was talking about interviewing people who had, you know, sort of still alive in the sort of recent past, I think I would love to know or sort of hear from folks how you're thinking about sort of late 20th century, early 21st now century history and incorporating the sort of, I don't want to say gift, but sort of the ability to now sort of look at a more active inclusive history collection. And how we do that in a way that that kind of, I don't want to say rights the wrongs, but helps us to avoid the issues we're having now with trying to go back and find things that don't exist. So anybody sort of doing some of that sort of late 20th century work now and have any thoughts on what to do or how to do it?
I have thoughts on this, but I don't think that we're doing a very good job of it. We have been working with some of the local groups in town, the local LGBTQ community in particular, housing a the Queer Connect archive here at the museum. And we've taken a few pieces from their collection as well to add to our collection. We have started a major assessment of our collection and deaccessioning some large pieces of our collection that are not relevant to Bennington, the glass in particular, and building an acquisitions fund with the goal being that we are going to go out and actually purchase pieces that are relevant to different disadvantaged groups. So actually being able to buy something that is related to the Indigenous population, that's related to the Black population, that's related to the LGBTQ community. We recently purchased a couple of pieces by Pedro Bramhall, a transgender woman who was one of the first glassblowers here in Vermont in the 60s. So it's definitely been a very intentional thing. But like I said, I'm not sure that we're doing a really good, because still when something pretty comes up, we end up, instead of buying something from a marginalized community, we end up buying a Ferrara pot made by a white man in Middlebury in the 1820s. But you know, it's great, it's wonderful, it's a lovely piece, wonderful to have it in our collection, but it's more white history. It's not really getting at those things that we should be adding to the collection. But we're trying. It's a work in progress.
So at the Historical Society here in the Catskills, I am I'm much younger than all of the board members who have been doing the archiving and the archivists here. My job here is the office director. So I'm relatively new to this position and to this world in general. But it's been really informative, and it's also really piqued my interest in my local, more recent history of the late 20th century. And I'm noticing that when I approach the board about it, they're less interested in it. They want to stick to the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, where it kind of all began here. And so my perspective now, I feel like I need to find more people, more diversity in age and in gender and in every backgrounds, which is very hard in this community. But I can recognize that will be what broadens our history and what will make it a little bit more current and updated, and so that we don't have to, for instance, there's in the Catskills, we had Casa Susana, which I don't know if you've heard of it, but it was basically a camp in the Catskills for I don't know what they would have been called. I mean, back in the 60s and the 50s, I guess they would have been called cross-dressers, but these were men who would come to the Catskills for a weekend dressed as women, where they could just be free and be as they wanted to be. And there's this whole history here of that I would like to include, and I would like to discuss and bring into the community. I don't necessarily have the tools yet to do that on my own. So it's interesting to, I'm also worried that it will receive a lot of ridicule from these closed-minded people in the community, and who are very, they make their voices heard. So I guess for me, I guess I'm just searching for more support in the community to do these things before I can actually jump into it. But maybe I just need to jump into it.
I think it's important to get in touch with people in your community who are already doing similar work. So if there is a LGBT support group in your community that, is already doing this kind of work,
There
partnering
isn't.
with, well, that's unfortunate too.
It's a
In a neighboring community, perhaps?
Sorry, say that one more time.
Maybe in a neighboring community, like there's got to be someone around there somewhere, and maybe start one if there isn't, because
there may be one in a neighboring community. It's just, again, the board is very specific about the history that they want to talk to. They're very focused on mountaintop history, so it's hard to leave the Greene County area. But I think what you're saying would be helpful, to reach out to other communities. I mean, there are LGBTQ centers around here. They're just not in the mountaintop area. So that
with the schools too, because most of your schools these days have some kind of a support club.
I would look into it. Yeah, I'll look into that, into the school, and see. I unfortunately, the pessimist in me, knowing this community, doubts very much that there is that, but you never know. There might be.
And, in that case, you being on the front line and being supportive is probably very important too. And a lot of it is just, and as far as your board and your current supporters go, it takes a long time. I mean, I've been here at the museum for, how long have I been here? It's got to be almost 20 years now. We are a very different institution than we used to be. And a lot of it has been a very slow change, and a lot of, incremental baby steps to get us to the point where we could even talk about, doing something like this. And at this point, our board is pretty supportive of it, and our director is certainly supportive of it. But it has been a slow going. So, I mean, patience as much as anything.
I do want to encourage too, I mean, I know obviously, I just talked about place-based examples, which are huge. So like looking for that support within the community is key. But I do want to say that, at the same time, especially for a board, I mean, they're going to be looking for revenue numbers, they're going to be looking for attendance. I think, take a look at some of the national resources, certainly the ones that I dropped into the chat, but just other national resources. I mean, there's a national trend right now of what is expected from not only history museums, but also from schools and the types of history. And this is the direction absolutely that our field is going in. So I think, the more that you can bring back, again, going back to that idea of primary sources and sources in general, we've got those in the history community as well. I think the more that you can take some of these reports and tools back to you and show them to the board, be like, look, this is the direction that museums are going in order to be relevant, in order to preserve our history, in order to remain sustainable. These are the types of things that people are going to want to see, even if the louder voices right now don't seem to be that way.
Yeah, and I think one other sort of thing to tie back to that too is thinking about generational shifts. So again, that most folks involved in history organizations, especially at the local level, tend to be older generations. That's just a natural happening. And so, I think what we need to be aware of is that the audience for the work that we do isn't ever just the generation that we might be in, but generations before and or after. And again, a lot of times that's after, and there's lots of generational shifts going on. Things have sped up a lot in the last 50 years in regards to how people communicate, technology, the types of stories people are interested in, the types of experiences people are having. And I think just being aware as history organizations of how then our work fits into those different generations is going to be important, from taking us for what we're doing today to still being really healthy, vibrant organizations 50 years from now. And so, I don't think there's any answers to that. I think to me, that's just building awareness within our own communities as history people, that's something to be aware of, so that we don't just all kind of fade away because we aren't being relevant or responsive to what people are interested in the next generation or the generations to come. So yeah, so we do have about 10 minutes to go. So any other sort of thoughts or questions or things that people were sort of hoping to talk about today that we haven't talked about today yet, about, again, the broad communicating about history topic, which is gigantic.
Yeah. Raise your hand.
Dan.
I
Yeah.
you're muted, but Dan.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Dan Bragg. My wife and I are involved in, we're involved in establishing 3 historic signs. One for William Slade down south of Middlebury. One in Montpelier for William Upham, and her grandfather was heavily into the cooperative movement during the time of the Depression. But one of the thing I wanted to mention is that to the traditionalists and people who don't want to hear anything but the sanitized version and what they're accustomed to, is that if you only tell a rosy picture and a dishonest picture about your past, then you're going to lose inevitably, younger people are going to find out that, well, you're being relatively unstraight about where we came from, and you're going to lose the appreciation that younger people coming along are going to have for your history. You got to tell a straight story, or younger people are turn away from what you're talking about. And I can speak to that somewhat from experience in that I grew up during the Vietnam War period. I was, we were a Republican traditionalist family that believed all of the government narratives. And when we when it came to light that things were not quite what we were being told, there was a huge amount of alienation and disaffection that, you know, spent, well, my father and I were in years of conflict, which we ended up resolving. But if you want to keep people, you got to be straight.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think that's part of the problem with a lot of the way we talk about history these days. Like, we tend to talk about it as, you know, and this gets back to the LLH bulletin, that, you know, we tend to think about it in terms of right or wrong, and which is the right side, which is the wrong side. And I think that's very much to our detriment. And because if you're just looking at this one picture that is, you know, what you learned in school, George Washington chopped down the cherry tree, can't tell a lie, all is well. But we're not stupid. You know, you figure out sooner or later that, oh, wait a second, he actually, there are other things around here that are much less savory about George Washington. And when you sort of like leave that part off, I think that it leads to a greater distrust, which I think is part of the problem that we have now, where, you know, people don't necessarily want to engage with history. They don't believe what you say. They look at that Confederate monument and say, well, this is set in stone, this must be absolutely right. Because that's the object that they can touch. Like, that's the object they see, and that's the story that they take with it. Rather than like the whole, you know, complexity of, you know, you need to look at all of these sources and you need to really examine what's going on, not just take this happy story and go on your merry way.
Well, frequently with people, they do really good things on the one hand and do really ridiculous things on the other hand. And why is that? You know, I mean, you know, early in the early labor movement, there was lots of championing of, you know, workers and their, you know, what was happening to them in mines and things like that, but they hated immigrants. And why is that? You know, so people very seldom go forward in an even way. There's always an exception or a divot in their efforts, and it's kind of like the human condition, really.
What I think is so interesting about this whole like idea of history, that it's not this one even road that, you know, we made this decision and good things happen, we made this decision and good things happen. It's, you know, there were other decisions that could have been made, and we made this decision, and, you know, not very good things happened. And I think it gets back to how things really apply today, that, you know, you're faced with decisions every day, and you're trying to figure out, you know, is this the right one? Will good things happen if I make this decision versus whether I make that one? And being able to look back at the past and say, well, you know, in the past, people were faced with a similar decision. They did this. What do we think about it now? Or they did that, and clearly that was wrong. So how can we use that information now and try to do good things?
I think that nuance is important. And I just want to say too, like, I think, you know, that part of telling all parts of a story, like, it is still okay to, and I think this is the thing that I think people get tripped up on who are not necessarily following us down this road, is it's still okay to celebrate those good things, right? You know, it's still okay to say, you know, thanks to the founding fathers, you know, we have this entire new country, we had all this hope, we had all this independence, and especially as we're looking at the 250th coming up, right? You know, that it's okay to celebrate that, as long as we are still talking about all those other pieces too. And I think that's just it. Like, it's not all, you know, we're not trying to be constantly negative. We're not trying to take away from what those things meant to people during that time. We want to celebrate those wins and just continue talking about how there's still lots more work that we can do, and that we wouldn't be where we were today if we weren't already doing that work too.
Right. And the other thing too is that if you don't tell the bad stories, you tend to run the risk of locking in bad behavior and making it repeatable. Seeing it means that you aren't likely to want to do that again, whatever it is.
Any other thoughts before we kind of wrap up for the day? Questions, burning questions for the day that we haven't gotten to.
I don't have a burning question, but could I put in a little plug here since I have a captive audience?
Sure.
The Ethan Allen Homestead Museum, as many of you know, we have a third Sunday of the month lecture. We're now in our 15th year with that program. In February on the 19th, Zach Bennett from Norwich University will be speaking, and his topic is why should we blame fish for why should we blame fish? Yeah, for the capitalism. And so it'll be a very different topic, but going into the economics area. We had Vera Longtoshian in January talking about the Abenaki experience with eugenics. So we do try to vary our topics greatly from month to month. And on February 5th, we have our book discussion. As you folks at VHS probably know, we're using 7 Years of Grace, the book published by the Vermont Historical Society. That will be a Zoom book discussion on February 5th at 3 p.m. We're encouraging people who have not read the book to join us to hear about it and perhaps be able to add their comments to the discussion. So you can get all that information on the Ethan Allen Homestead website. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, John. And yeah, I should say before we go, the plug of I think the vast majority of you are already on our local history e-newsletter, and some of you are on our listserv. But again, if you want to put your own events on that, we share that out with our e-newsletter lists and on our website. So it's a great way to get the word out and also to hear what we're doing that you might be interested in as well. So we're always happy to keep communicating and sharing all the amazing history work that's going on in the state. So yeah, with that, Tori, any last thoughts before we head out?
Just, my email address is on the website. Please, if you have any questions, reach out to me. I'm happy to share more about these specific reports, but, just like Eileen said, constantly interested in hearing more about, the types of things that are actually affecting you guys in your own communities, just because obviously that's a lot different than necessarily what's happening in the state writ large.
Great. Thanks, Tori. And again, I will be sending everybody a link with the recording of this session. Obviously, you guys were here, but feel free to share that with other folks sort of in your community or institution if you'd like to. And again, our next virtual roundtable will be on February 23rd, and I'll be joined by my colleague Teresa. We'll be talking about collections donation issues, which I know is always a big fun topic. So we'll look forward to seeing hopefully a lot of you then. So thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.